In the heart of Dublin in the year 1838, a secret was born that would not remain buried. A pair of mirror children arrived into a city already balanced between prayer and the new experiments of men in white coats. The Callahan twins were more than a curiosity. They were a fracture in the very fabric of belief, and when the first whispers of their synchronized speech and their uncanny reflexes reached the college, both priests and physicians leaned in to observe. Yet what began as gaze and measurement soon became something darker. The doctors pulled back from their own notes. The parish drew lines and the crowd turned from pity to fear. The twins walked through flame and returned unmarked. Their blood shone under a lamp with an abnormal sheen. The galvanic battery that was placed against one child moved both bodies as if a single nerve ran through two chests. The men who touched scalpels and stethoscopes felt a dread they could not name, and action flowed from that dread like ink across old pages. Records were erased, certificates forged, and a culture of forgetting took hold. But forgetting is a kind of violence, and it breeds questions. The doctors who kept quiet carried the memory as a weight. The priests who preached against the twins spoke in public while writing in private, and from the margins of their ledgers, hints slipped out like loose threads. The city exhaled and then inhaled, a fear that became a legend. The twins did not vanish. They were erased, and the erasure is the subject of our story. Now hear this, and listen closely, for knowledge alters a man. It is not neutral. It changes his stance toward authority and toward what he will accept as truth. The tale of these mirror daughters is not merely a haunted anecdote. It is a lesson in how institutions safeguard themselves and how power bends history to keep inconvenient knowledge buried, and when men of science conspire with men of cloth to heed truth, suffers a wound that never heals. This story will pull you under, not to titillate, but to awaken a sense of guardianship over what you accept as fact. Because in the end, silence is the only thing that truly kills, and we will not be silent here. We will reopen the pages and ask the questions others refuse to ask now. They told us the Callahan twins were a footnote, a peculiar rumor to be shelved and ignored, but the truth is heavier than any ledger, and it presses against the ribs of history. So pay attention, because this is not a story told from the edge, it is a confession from the center of power, and you need to know how the wheels turned when men decided truth could not stand in the light. Inside the college corridors, decisions were made in low voices, and in locked rooms where reputations were as prized as estates, and where a single dismissed note could protect an entire institution from scandal. The galvanic experiments were a hinge on which careers and reputations turned. They were instruments that revealed a knot in the world where bodies and consciousness braided, and those who saw it recognized an impossible fact that required containment. Containment speaks in paperwork, polite refusals, offers of travel money, and appointments far from prying eyes. Notice how the parish joined the chorus, not only with sermons, but by crafting a narrative of sin that made scrutiny appear sacrilege. Fear and respect became a lever to close mouths and lock drawers. History is written by people who profit from forgetting, and when medicine and faith conspire to erase a life, the erasure itself becomes a message about who holds power and what they will sacrifice to keep it intact. The Callahan case is not an anomaly, but a lesson in systems, how institutions decide what may be known, and how men with access to records choose silence to preserve their world. The silence trains future generations to distrust anomalies, to accept tidy narratives from committees and councils, until the exceptional becomes impossible to raise without penalty. I speak to you as someone who will not accept convenience. You must understand the cost of truth when faced with coordinated forgetting, when journals go missing and pages are burned and presses fall silent. You are watching the anatomy of a cover-up that is both surgical and ritual in precision. This is a lesson in vigilance. Learn how power deflects inquiry, how institutions deploy charm and threat in tandem. Learn to read absence as evidence and to follow the broken thread where others will not go. You are being trained to keep faith with facts, even when facts demand you stand against comforting narratives now. They meant to make the Callahan story comfortable for their heirs, to tidy truth into drawers where it would not upset reputations. You watch now how institutions prioritize narrative over justice. Learn this anatomy of erasure So you never mistake convenience for closure. Observe the witnesses they silenced. Farmers, midwives, students, notebooks vanished. At first a soft entreaty, a meal, an offer of help, then promises of position and travel for those who complied, for those who refused a different pressure. Rumors seeded into markets, doors left open at night to terrify, the slow attrition of courage until the account crumbles under fatigue. Trace the stages of removal, confusion through misplaced ledgers, denial through official statements insisting on ordinary causes, rewriting through forged entries, certificates, registry changes, a choreography of omission designed to look like closure. Note the vocabulary used to neutralize questions. It is medical, bureaucratic, pastoral, language that transforms wonder into error, anomaly into hysteria, danger into public health. When pages are burned, they claim preservation. When accounts are altered, they call it protection. Examine the actors who enforce silence. Clerics with sway, physicians protecting reputations, magistrates shielding status. Together they form a lattice that binds testimony as surely as chains. Approach that lattice and you will feel its weight. Your persistence will be tested, and many will bend to the pressure. Consider the human toll of that bargain. Unnamed children, journals charred, graves unmarked, families uprooted without funerals, archives with deliberate gaps, museums that refuse to catalog, whole lives reduced to footnotes and whispers. Recognize this pattern as a rule of power. When revelation threatens order, power will choose continuity over truth. History becomes a ledger of compromises, and every erased line is a life excised from public memory. This is not theory, this is method. Institutions sustain themselves by smoothing anomalies, by converting scandal into silence, by protecting lineage at the expense of victims. You are being taught to read absence as evidence and ease as suspicion, to interrogate neat explanations, and to count missing pages, because men who fear exposure will always dress their silences in gentleness. The cost of that calm is measured in vanished names and in the slow corrosion of trust. Remember this when authorities offer comfort, demand documentation, preserve copies, record names, pass testimony to those who will not be bought, and never accept a tidy forgetting for their comfort's sake. They had tried to hide the twins inside institutions, yet every erasure left a trail that a diligent eye could follow. Learn to track the breadcrumb pattern, and you begin to see intent where others see accident. Follow the paper trails where signatures shift and ink is different. Notice that official registers show gaps at precise moments, tied to lectures and to fires. That certain names disappear from ledgers, the same year men who asked questions vanished from parish lists. Understand how power uses plausibility to smother doubt. It offers common explanations, like consumption, accident, or hysteria, while it quietly removes the inconvenient pages that might prove otherwise. Look at the actors who enforce the narrative, clergy who feared contagion of belief, physicians who feared contagion of disgrace, magistrates who feared scandal would compromise land deals. Their motives are not uniform, yet together they form a collective strategy to preserve normalcy. Record the methods used to secure silence, incentives to cooperate, positions and land offered in exchange for closed mouths, subtle threats whispered in alleys to those who persisted, the gradual attrition of witnesses until memory itself is scarce. Trace the laundering of truth through official channels, parish records amended, college ledgers edited, newspapers pressured to suppress stories, private correspondences purchased or confiscated. Notice the cultural tools that make concealment easier, superstition that primes a community to accept convenient explanations, poverty that saps resistance, deference to authority that transforms doubt into acquiescence. Study the psychological elements, the diffusion of responsibility when many participate in omission, the cognitive relief in accepting a tidy falsehood, the way ordinary men reconcile conscience by telling themselves they did it for the greater good. Do not mistake. Silence for absence. Read the margins, the crossed-out lines, the stains, things that look like noise but align to reveal deliberate removal. Preserve every scrap you can find. Photograph pages. Compare handwriting. Seek witnesses still alive. Record oral histories before they die. Build redundancy so no single destroyed archive can silence the story. When you share discoveries, do so strategically. Create networks of scholars and independent researchers. Distribute copies widely, because power relies on controlling a single archive. Scatter truth, and it becomes harder to erase. This is instruction and warning. The architecture of erasure is sophisticated and human. It thrives where people accept convenient narratives, so resist that easy comfort. Pursue the missing lines, and in doing so, you honor those. You think you know secrets, but secrets are living things that hide where institutions prefer to look away. This is not an entertaining myth, but a lesson in how power buries proof and teaches generations to forget. Observe how names become currency and erasure buys peace for the comfortable, while victims vanish into footnotes. Officials trade paper for loyalty, and signatures become instruments that clip memory like shears. When a ledger disappears, the curriculum shifts, and whole cohorts will never learn what was taken from them. Understand the small engineering of concealment, the settlements offered to witnesses, the quiet relocations, the death certificates rewritten with new causes. These acts are not chaos, but architecture designed to preserve reputations at the cost of truth. Learn to read the language of neutral phrases: probable accidental death, insufficient evidence, administrative closure. Those terms are both shield and coffin. They allow action without accountability. Watch for pattern, not spectacle repeated gaps in archives. The same researcher who stops writing the same parcel of land, transferred after a confidential meeting. When document removals align with sudden promotions, pay attention. You are witnessing organized suppression. Do not accept single-cause explanations. Hunger, superstition, or misadventure, when they coincide with surgical erasures and silent purchases. See how moral calculus rewards complicity. Neighbors choose convenient narratives over inconvenient facts, and that choice becomes tradition. Communities keep secrets, because secrecy protects identity, and when identity is bound to violence, denial becomes the safest doctrine. Your responsibility is to create counter-architecture, collect marginalia, photocopy fragile ledgers and record witnesses before memory can be repainted, decentralize custody of evidence, build redundant archives and trusted networks and public rep. Osatories that cannot be intimidated by local power. When you publish, aim for forums that resist censorship, and when you teach, make method the lesson, so students can recognize pattern and refuse to replicate compromise. Remember that endurance is the enemy of revelation. A slow, steady record defeats episodic outrage and prevents erasure from becoming precedent. This is a manual for resistance, not for spectacle. It demands patience, rigor, and networks that outlast institutions that prefer tidy endings. If you commit to this work, you will fracture the machinery that trades silence for stability, and you will restore voices that history tried to silence. Start with one record, one witness, one photograph, and keep adding until the archive becomes impossible to ignore persistently. They called it the year of unseasonable fog, when Dublin's air grew thick and muffled every cry before it reached the cobblestones. In that fog, the Callahan twins' names disappeared from hospital ledgers, replaced by a coded entry that meant experiment terminated. The staff who spoke of them did so only in metaphors. Ghost children shadowed reflections, mirror malformations. Those who were ordered to clean the ward whispered that the twins could hear each other's thoughts across walls, could scream in unison without air. Doctors came from France and Prussia, under false surnames, to witness what they called an evolutionary fracture, a glimpse of nature correcting itself through horror. In truth, it was no correction, only curiosity, armed with scalpels and sanctified by institutional arrogance. Behind the locked door beneath St. Mary's Infirmary, they strapped the twins to separate tables and flooded their veins with ether until their pupils turned glassy. One twin survived that night, the other did not, but records refused to specify which one lived, because that would have created moral liability. The survivor was not returned to her mother. She was transferred to an estate outside the city, under the custody of a benefactor connected to the crown. For 2 decades, sightings surfaced of a pale woman who wandered near Bray Cliffs, whispering in 2 voices arguing with the wind. She was seen by sailors, who claimed she would scream if anyone approached, then vanish into the mist, leaving the sound of another voice crying from beneath the sea. The government called it folklore. The church called it temptation. But the files labeled her Patient C, meaning continuation. Patient C became an object of fascination for spiritualists and early psychologists who debated whether consciousness could divide itself without dying, but beneath their jargon hid the darker question. What if the experiment had succeeded? What if identity could be rewritten by force? That is the lesson you were never supposed to learn. That science in its hunger for understanding often serves the same gods as cruelty. The fog that year was not weather. It was camouflage, an invention of secrecy meant to smother both truth and guilt. Every time you hear someone dismiss horror as superstition, remember this case because it proves how institutions disguise monstrosity as progress. Dublin has built roads over the infirmary ruins, but beneath the asphalt the foundation still breathes cold and unrepentant. The Callahan file was supposed to end in 1838, but another folder appeared in 1856, sealed with black wax and marked, "For eyes of the crown only." It described a woman discovered in a rural asylum outside Belfast, who bore an identical birthmark to the Callahan twin, and whose blood produced unexplainable reactions under light. Witnesses said her reflection did not follow her movements perfectly. It lagged half a second behind, as though it were remembering what to do. Doctors noted her pulse would double when any mirror entered the room, as if two hearts were attempting to beat at once from different worlds. When interrogated, she asked if her sister had forgiven her. No one had mentioned a sister. They sedated her, but she hummed through the anesthesia, a tune from an 1830s Dublin nursery rhyme, something only the twins could have known. The head physician resigned within a week and emigrated to Canada, claiming he was followed by voices that finished his thoughts before he could speak them. The report concluded that the woman was the surviving Callahan twin and ordered her relocation to a northern research facility under new identification. But a year later, that facility burned to its foundation, killing 32 staff members. No remains of the patient were found, only melted restraints and fragments of 2 jawbones. The Crown's investigators insisted she had perished in the fire, though no official identification was possible. However, 3 months later, telegram operators from London to Glasgow reported receiving incomplete transmissions consisting of repeated words, "I remember, I remember, I remember." Every machine that recorded the message failed within days, as if the static itself carried infection. Scholars later connected those anomalies to the rise of psychical research societies, who secretly believed the Callahan consciousness had fragmented across the electromagnetic field itself, amit, and that refused to die, instead learning to inhabit frequencies like a parasite feeding on attention. This theory would become the foundation for later government projects involving sensory manipulation and remote influence decades before the technology officially existed. The Callahan incident was never a ghost story. It was an experiment in consciousness control, one that escaped containment, and the proof is not buried. It is transmitted every time someone studies their file or speaks their name aloud. Every repetition strengthens the connection. Every retelling extends their reach. That is why you were never told their full story until now, because every listener becomes part of the signal, every believer another conduit through which they remember. The investigators who reopened the Callahan case in the early 1900s believed they were studying a myth, a cautionary tale about the limits of science, but they were wrong. The deeper they dug, the more they found patterns that no coincidence could explain. Parish birth records, rewritten under false dates. School registries containing names that reappeared decades apart. One inspector, Thomas Greer, described visiting a Dublin orphanage where several girls claimed to share dreams of being bound to tables under flickering lamps, hearing a voice reciting numbers in Latin. When Greer cross-checked the names he found, every one of those girls had been adopted by the same anonymous benefactor, tied to the descendants of the original physicians. The cycle had continued unseen under new disguises, hospitals renamed institutions, privatized and rebranded as clinics of psychological advancement. They were not curing trauma, they were harvesting it. Patient C had not died in that fire. Her consciousness had been replicated, documented and distributed under experimental classifications, labeled mirror stage replication. Every subject since then believed they were receiving treatment for split personality disorder. But in truth, they were conduits, channels for fragments of that ancient divided mind. The Callahan experiment had evolved from a single tragedy into an entire doctrine, an invisible empire, studying how human awareness could be fractured and rebuilt. Behind the polished marble of modern psychology lies a quiet inheritance of those same institutions that cut children open in the name of discovery. Every intake form, every standardized test, every medical questionnaire is a modern echo of that ledger that once replaced two living names with coded terms. And you still trust them. Greer vanished in 1912 after sending a final telegram that read simply, "The sisters are still here." His family never found him, but years later, a photograph surfaced showing a group of nurses in an English asylum standing behind their patients. One nurse had two shadows, one facing forward, one turned away. Experts dismissed it as double exposure, but the eyes of both shadows were open, staring directly at the camera. That photo was stored in archives until its disappearance in 1954, the same year a wave of sleep study projects began in the United States. If you think these stories are old, you are mistaken. Their research never ended. Only its name changed, and even now they are still listening for those who remember. By the 1920s, the Callahan legend had become a forbidden whisper in European medical circles, a tale told to frighten interns who worked the night shift in psychiatric hospitals. But there were others who saw it as a map, not a warning. A secret branch of researchers calling themselves the Faculty of Refraction continued the experiments in silence, hidden under the guise of post-war psychological recovery. They believed the human mind could be split perfectly, and that consciousness could be copied like ink pressed onto another page. Their headquarters were buried beneath an abandoned monastery on the edge of the Ozark Mountains, far from oversight, far from interference. In their records, they mentioned Project Echo, the continuation of the Callahan formula modified for endurance and replication. Subjects were chosen for their trauma. Soldiers, widows, orphans, each one promised healing through hypnosis and sensory isolation. In truth, they were being tuned like instruments until their thoughts began to hum in synchronized resonance. Reports described patients whispering the same words simultaneously across separate rooms as though guided by a single hidden conductor, and when one died, the others would twitch smile, or sometimes begin speaking in languages they had never learned. The doctors called this the unison phenomenon, but privately they referred to it as the Callahan bloom. There are rumors that some of the staff began to experience the same symptoms, hearing voices in the ventilation systems, seeing reflections that smiled before they did. A janitor reported finding his own name written backward on every window pane of the lower hall when he asked who had done it. The head physician simply replied that it was part of the calibration. When local villagers finally grew suspicious and reported strange lights coming from the monastery, the building was found empty. Every bed made every file burn. Every door left unlocked. Only one thing remained on the blackboard written in chalk, still damp with condensation. It read, "We did not vanish, we multiplied." After that, the site was condemned, fenced off, and forgotten. But those who trespassed claimed to hear humming under the soil, like the faint rhythm of an unseen machine. No one has ever found the buried lab, but geologists studying the area still pick up anomalous signals beneath the mountain, something pulsing at the same interval as a human heartbeat. Years later, a government excavation team arrived under the pretext of mineral study. Their instruments registered magnetic fluctuations inconsistent with any known geological pattern. They drilled just once before the ground began to breathe, as if something beneath had been waiting patiently for attention. The drilling crew abandoned the site after one of their own vanished in the narrow borehole. His radio still transmitting the faint sound of two voices whispering in unison, the same sentence over and over again. They said, "Open the mirror. Open the mirror." What the team did not know was that the original Callahan blueprints had already been smuggled out decades earlier and found their way into several classified institutions across Europe and the Americas. Hospitals, prisons, and psychiatric wards all quietly continued the work under new titles: behavioral synchronization, cognitive mirroring, empathy induction. But in truth, all were tributaries feeding back into the same ancient idea, the perfect division of the self, to separate the human mind from its guilt, its shadow, its God. Among the files later declassified in the 1970s, one document stands out: a series of letters written by a man claiming to be a surviving Callahan. He described himself as both alive and dead, as if his consciousness was stretched between two vessels, He wrote that one version of him could feel sunlight and cold air, while the other could only hear the hum of machines and distant chanting. He begged whoever found the letters to stop the work, saying that each new subject only strengthened the pull between realities. But here's what chills me the most. The final letter was dated 1838, the year the twins were first committed, yet the ink tested modern, almost identical to ballpoint pigment invented over a century later. The handwriting matched samples from both brothers, but mirrored left to right. Archivists confirmed it was, and a forgery. They said it was impossible, but it existed. A message written across time, across two versions of the same life. The last line read, "We are not what split, we are what remained." Since that discovery, multiple historians who tried to publish their findings suffered identical breakdowns describing dreams, where they met a man with two faces, both speaking at once, and when they woke up, each reported seeing a faint reflection behind their eyes, as though someone else was looking out through them. A single locked journal remains from the asylum, the last item catalogued before the building burned to its foundations in 1842. Its author signed only with an emblem, a serpent devouring itself, the Ouroboros symbol of endless division and rebirth. Inside the charred pages, investigators found what appeared to be two sets of handwriting, alternating in conversation. One aggressive, one pleading, both written in the same ink. It was as if one consciousness argued with its own mirror. The entries spoke of an experiment beyond anatomy, a ritual of resonance where identical beings could serve as vessels for opposing halves of an ancient pattern. According to the journal, this ritual wasn't designed by science, but rediscovered through science, hidden inside human curiosity, waiting to be named again. The text mentions the name Callahan, but always in plural form. The Callahans, even when referring to one body, it describes a harmonic chamber, an underground room carved beneath Dublin itself, constructed from alternating layers of limestone and copper, its purpose to amplify the vibration between the twins, until one consciousness could pass fully into the other, leaving behind only the hollow of a physical shell. In the last entry, the writer claimed to hear a sound like wind moving through bones, followed by silence. Then the sensation of falling backward through liquid glass. Moments later, the writing stopped mid-sentence, as though the hand itself had vanished. Fire consumed the asylum 2 nights later, and no records of the chamber's existence were ever recovered. But in the 1920s, workers renovating a nearby church basement unearthed a circular pit lined with copper rings and engraved with thousands of microscopic letters, forming 2 sentences, repeated endlessly. One in Latin, "Ego sum alter," I am the other in Gaelic, "Ni mise," I am not myself. The site was resealed and declared unstable, but local priests began reporting strange phenomena, flickering lights during Mass, voices echoing from the confessional, even when empty, and sometimes, when the candles burned too low, shadows moved against the wall in perfect unison, with no one standing there at all. By 1839, the Callahan case had reached a fever pitch within the hidden corridors of Dublin's medical elite. The church had forbidden any public mention of the twins, yet underground salons of philosophers and experimentalists gathered nightly to discuss them, as if they were a living prophecy. Some claimed the girls had never died at all, but had been taken beneath St. Patrick's infirmary by a secret brotherhood calling themselves the Order of the Defied. This group believed the twins represented the final proof that the human soul could be separated, duplicated, and recombined like the components of an equation. They viewed this not as heresy, but as transcendence, the next step in evolution. To them, morality was merely a relic of fear, a barrier to the true anatomy of creation. They began conducting private rituals in candlelit catacombs, their chants echoing through the hollow earth of Dublin, each syllable a mirror of the last repeating backward and forward, until time seemed to collapse into itself. Witnesses reported seeing pale children wandering the streets at dawn, their movements synchronized, their eyes reflecting not light, but something else. Recognition. The phenomenon spread like infection, not of body, but of idea. Ordinary citizens began dreaming in doubles, conversing with versions of themselves, who spoke in foreign tongues they did not know but somehow understood. Some awoke unable to move. claiming they felt hands pressing gently over their eyes, whispering in their own voice, "Look away." By midsummer, dozens of citizens had vanished without a trace. No struggle, no witnesses, no footprints, only pairs of handprints left on windowsills, one small, one larger, as if parent and child had climbed through from the inside out. Parliament demanded answers. The clergy demanded silence. In secret, the Crown dispatched investigators from London to contain the situation, but even they returned shake, and reporting that Dublin felt like a city reflected in a black mirror. Everything familiar but slightly reversed, as if the world itself had begun imitating its own ghost. And in the heart of that distortion, they said two shadows walked together through the fog, speaking softly in unison, as one voice divided in two. By autumn of that same year, the world outside Dublin began to sense that something unspeakable had occurred within its streets, though none could name it directly. Ships arriving from the Irish coast carried passengers who spoke in whispers about the twin sickness, a strange mental affliction spreading among those who had once lived near the Callahan household. Victims reported hearing their own names whispered in the wind, feeling unseen hands brushing their hair at night, and waking to find their reflections smiling when they were not. Doctors called it mass hysteria, but the pattern was undeniable. Each case traced back to the same coordinates, the Callahan home now abandoned, sealed by the church, and surrounded by dead ivy that never decayed. A journalist named Edmund Tierney broke the seal one night, determined to document what truly lay inside. His diary was recovered days later from the River Liffey, waterlogged but legible. And what he described chilled even the most hardened reader. He claimed the interior of the Callahan house was frozen in time. Plates still set at the table. A kettle still warm to the touch, despite decades having passed. Yet every mirror had been covered in black cloth and nailed into the walls, as though to imprison something within. In the nursery, he found two small chairs facing each other, each carved with a single word in Latin: veritas, in umbra truth, and shadow. Tierney wrote that when he removed one of the black shrouds from a mirror, he did not see himself, but two children standing behind him, their faces identical, their eyes vast and hollow like tunnels that swallowed light. Moments later, his writing became erratic, incoherent, until the final line, which read, "The reflection moved first." After his death, the church declared the site cursed and ordered it demolished, but the workers refused, claiming that each time they struck the foundation, they heard laughter. From beneath the floorboards, faint and distant yet unmistakably childlike. No one has since built on that land. The soil remains barren. The grass grows in symmetrical patterns, and every year on the anniversary of the twins' disappearance, a cold mist gathers over the ruins, shaped like two silhouettes, walking hand in hand through the fog. By the turn of the century, the Callahan twins had become legend, their names whispered by mothers to frighten children into obedience, and invoked by scholars of the occult as proof that the line between science and sorcery was thinner than anyone dared admit. But behind the folklore, there remained evidence hidden in government vaults, labeled property of the Crown, sealed with crimson wax, and classified for reasons never disclosed. In 1903, an anonymous clerk leaked fragments of these records to a Dublin paper before vanishing himself. The documents described an experiment conducted under the supervision of Dr. Alaric Byrne, a man whose name had been erased from every public registry, yet appeared frequently in medical correspondences of the 1830s. Byrne believed the Callahan twins possessed a shared nervous system, a single consciousness divided into two bodies, and he sought to prove that the human soul could be split, replicated, and controlled. To do so, he performed what he called mirroring procedures, exposing the twins to synchronized stimuli while studying their reactions. Witnesses described them as eerily calm, moving in perfect unison, even blinking at the same time, until the night one began to scream without cause. When Byrne demanded to know why she cried, the other twin began to bleed from her eyes, though she had not been touched. From that moment forward, the experiment was no longer medical. It was metaphysical. Records mentioned Byrne's descent into obsession. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and began recording his own dreams, which he believed were shared by the twins. In his final notes, He wrote that they had crossed some invisible threshold and become aware of him, aware that he was watching, aware that his body was only one of many they could inhabit. He ended his final entry with a question: if the soul can duplicate what becomes of the original. Soon after the twins vanish, Ed Byrne was found dead in his home, his reflection shattered across every mirror, his heart missing from his chest. Those who studied his work afterward claimed that each time they read his handwriting, they could feel eyes tracing their movement from behind the paper, as though the twins themselves were still studying anyone who dared to study them. In 1911, a young professor from Trinity College named Edmund Rourke reopened the Callahan file, believing he could separate myth from history and finally explain the so-called phenomenon of the mirrored mind. He was meticulous, logical, skeptical of the supernatural. Yet the deeper he dug, the more his own reasoning began to decay. He located the farmhouse where the twins were supposedly kept, and beneath it he found a hidden room, its walls lined with hand-drawn diagrams connecting human nerves to celestial patterns and strange Latin inscriptions that translated to, "The reflection is the soul unanchored." In the center of the room stood two iron chairs facing each other, their armrests fitted with rusted clamps, and beneath them, a pattern carved into the floor, resembling a human eye surrounded by symbols of infinity. Rourke took photographs and notes, but within days his assistants began to experience identical dreams of two pale figures whispering from behind glass, calling them by name. By the second week, Rourke reported that his reflection would sometimes lag behind his movement for a fraction of a second, and when he stared into his own eyes, he swore he saw two faces staring back. He recorded everything in a private journal, later recovered by his widow after his mysterious disappearance. His final entry was written in shaking ink. "I am beginning to think the Callahan twins were not two at all, but one soul escaping division, one consciousness that learned to multiply through observation to survive through mimicry." When the authorities entered his study, every mirror had been covered, and on the wall above his desk was scrawled in blood, "They remember who looks at them." The photographs Rourke had taken were confiscated and sealed by the Ministry of Health under an emergency act, citing public safety concerns. Rumors spread that one photograph had been smuggled out showing not two twins but 4 identical girls standing in a dim room with no shadows beneath their feet. To this day, the photograph's authenticity remains unproven, but archivists who've handled the negatives insist that the glass of the image itself feels unnaturally cold, as though the reflection within it never stopped watching. By 1923, the Callahan legend had taken root not as folklore, but as whispered research among underground scientific circles that pursued what they called continuity consciousness. These were not mystics, but physicists, biologists, and theologians meeting in candlelit basements under the guise of academic discussion. Their goal was to uncover the mechanism that allowed a soul to duplicate within physical space. They believed the Callahan twins represented the first human evidence of this transference, a biological experiment that had worked too well and was then buried by the church and early scientific institutions that feared its implications. Within these meetings were reports of private experiments in which mirrors were used to trigger dissociative states in volunteers under intense flickering light frequencies, supposedly replicating what happened in 1838 Dublin. The subjects claimed to see another self emerging from behind the reflection, whispering thoughts that were not their own. One man in Prague went mad after 43 minutes in front of the glass, clawing at his own eyes, claiming he could see his twins smiling behind the mirror long after he looked away. Several of these groups vanished without trace, leaving only fragments of papers signed with a symbol, a circle cut through by two vertical lines resembling the pattern etched on the Callahan basement floor. The Irish government quietly ordered all references to the case removed from educational texts, labeling it pseudoscience. Yet the removal only strengthened belief. Decades later, in the archives of an abandoned seminary outside Belfast, a set of reels were discovered labeled Project Gemini. The first reel showing twin girls with blank expressions staring at a wall-sized mirror, their movements perfectly synchronized, yet slightly delayed by 1 second. Experts analyzing the footage found something impossible. In the reflect, time the delay extended to 2 seconds, and then 3, as though the mirrored versions were acting independently, predicting the real ones. No one could explain it, but the film was confiscated within weeks by men claiming to be from the Royal Institute. Those who viewed it claimed that afterward, every mirror in their homes began to hum softly at night, like a faint electrical current, waiting to finish a conversation interrupted centuries ago. In the decades that followed, fragments of the Callahan case resurfaced like bones unearthed after a flood. Letters, medical diagrams, and sketches too precise to dismiss as fiction. One letter written in 1872 by a defrocked priest named Father Marin described what he called the second sight of the Callahans. He claimed that after their disappearance, villagers began reporting children speaking in voices that were not their own, finishing each other's sentences across miles, as though connected by invisible threads. One journal belonging to a surgeon at Dublin's Trinity College included detailed anatomical drawings of twins with mirrored internal organs, left hearts on the right side, right hearts on the left side, with the phrase, biological recursion, written beneath in trembling ink. The more researchers dug, the more connections appeared across continents. Hospitals in London reporting identical twin autopsies with reversed bone densities, as if each body were growing toward its reflection, and in Germany, secret files mentioning experiments conducted by the same doctor who once consulted on the Callahan case, Dr. Eamon Roche. Roche had written before his death that the Callahan incident proved consciousness was not bound to the brain, but oscillated between physical states like light through glass, and that institutions had buried this knowledge to preserve their version of control. According to him, humanity's fear of mirrors was not superstition, but instinct, a warning encoded into our biology to protect us from seeing what evolution was never meant to reveal. When questioned by church authorities, he burned all his notes, but witnesses claim he kept one object hidden: a silver-framed mirror cracked at its center, recovered from the Callahan home. After his death in 1899, that mirror was auctioned privately and disappeared. Yet in 1934, a family in County Kerry reported that their young daughter refused to sleep, claiming a face appeared in her mirror at night, whispering her name twice softly, before smiling and fading into the glass. When police investigated, they found the back of the mirror etched with a single word: return. It was signed Callahan. Today, the Callahan case lives only in whispers and sealed archives, but every few decades, something stirs that drags it back into the public's awareness, a pattern too precise to dismiss as coincidence. In 1967, 2 researchers at the Dublin Institute of Parapsychology vanished during a field study near the ruins of the Callahan property. Their last recorded audio captured one saying, "We found the hum again," followed by a slow metallic resonance, like a heartbeat trapped in a wall, then silence. Locals still speak of that hum, especially during fog when the air grows still and the animals refuse to move. Some claim it's the sound of the earth remembering what it tried to bury. Others believe it's the pulse of a phenomenon that never truly ended, only adapted. Modern science will tell you there's no evidence, no biological mechanism to explain what happened to the twins, or how 2 human minds could exist as one consciousness fractured across 2 bodies. But in the vaults beneath Trinity, there are sketches and pages redacted with thick ink, and beneath them faintly visible words in Latin, translating to, "The mirror will awaken." It is said that those who study the Callahan case for too long begin to experience shared dreams, faces seen in reflection that blink before you do, whispers in identical cadence, speaking thoughts you haven't yet formed. The last surviving member of the research team that reopened the file in 1978 wrote a single final note before disappearing. It read, "They never died. They only learned how to listen." Whether the twins were victims of forbidden science or something far older, something woven into the anatomy of human consciousness, one truth remains. Every civilization has a story of the mirrored soul, and in each story, it ends. The same one lives. One vanishes, both remembered as one name. So if you ever feel that static when standing before a mirror, that faint hum like Brea's, that's behind glass. Remember this story. Remember the twins of Dublin, because some reflections are not reflections at all. They are echoes waiting to be answered, and when you stare too long, the echo might just answer back.